Welcome everyone to this Sussex Development Lecture, the very first of this academic year by Professor Ganesh Devy, whom I'll introduce in a minute. My name is Saurabh Arora. I work at Science Policy Research Unit here at University of Sussex, and the Sussex Development Lectures are co-organized by SPRU, where I'm based, but also by IDS here, where we are located right now, by the Center of International Education, and by the School of Global Studies, if I'm correct. And it's a sort of a flagship lecture series on development issues here at Sussex, and which brings together people from different departments. And we are very honored to have a number of high-profile speakers, including Professor Devy today, who doesn't really need an introduction, in my view. He is very well known in India. For those of us from India have learned from his works, his many, many books. I think now they number in the 70s, or perhaps even more than that. By the way, he is originally a literary theorist, a philosopher, an activist, an intellectual. He wears many hats, and he is one of the founders, or perhaps the founder, of the very famous Adivasi Academy in Tejgarh in Gujarat. He started the Bhasha Research and Publication Center in Baroda. Before all of that, he also had an academic career. And as part of that academic career, he wrote a classic book that all of us love. It's called After Amnesia from '92, which got the Sahitya Academy Award, which, by the way, he returned in 2016 in protest, along with many other famous scholars and activists at that time, against the rising intolerance in our dear part of the world, which unfortunately continues to be the case. And as I think a response to that intolerance, Professor Devy has just co-edited a new volume of essays called The Indians, Histories of a Civilization. Well, I'm not going to talk a lot more about this book or anything else. Without much further ado, I will pass the microphone to Professor Devy. I just wanted to say, though, the posters do not actually show his right affiliation at the moment. He just, from today, he has a new position in a university called Somaiya Vidya Vihar University in Bombay, where he is currently the dean and senior professor of eminence in the Faculty of Languages and Literature, and the director of the Center for Civilization Studies. So I will now pass on to Professor Devy. And by the way, I just wanted to say that there'll be questions, plenty of time for questions, about 45 minutes at the end. So Professor Devy will speak for about 40 odd minutes. And for those of you who are joining on Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom to post any questions that you might have, and we'll pick them up here and Professor Devy will address them. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, scholars of eminence, research students present here, I must say before I begin my lecture how wonderful it is for me as a privilege to be here. And I want to thank the director of this world-famous institution of development studies. Thank you, indeed. It's indeed a privilege being with you, because I'm here not to bring any new knowledge to you. My purpose is very simple. It is to learn something from all of you. Let me place it more elaborately before you. As we are today in the world, we have two main streets ahead of us. One says, come here and you will have the benefit of a Dyson shell kind of energy generation, which will allow you to travel between the Earth and the Jupiter, Earth and the Mars, between breakfast and lunch, and everybody will have trillions of times of energy supply, making life absolutely as wonderful as we imagine life for angels and gods. That's one picture of the coming world before us. I mean, you obviously heard of the Dyson shell. Is an idea to capture maximum energy by that the Earth receives by creating a kind of artificial cover, tens of thousands of kilometers or miles in England above the surface of the earth, which one can open and shut by using remotes, as we do with our televisions. There is also, allied to this picture, the invitation from the virtual world, where we can bring the future and the past to collapse together, create a cosmos for ourselves at our will, and surf through, glide through as seamlessly as one can imagine in that cosmos, and become like Homo Deus. I mean, not Homo sapiens, not the stupid intelligent animal, but godlike animal. That virtual world has been beckoning us, all of us, and all of us have very enthusiastically decided to drown ourselves, engross ourselves into that world. Every human, on an average, is now spending about 10 hours a day in contact with that virtual world. There's also allied to this idea of development is the idea of humans conquering at least a part of bodily decline, if not all of death. All these ideas are ideas taken seriously by many people in the world, and most of all, the policymakers. There is another road ahead of us, which as scientists have been telling us in recent times more actively, with a greater concern, and that is where the planet Earth will be left by us as a charred planet, where all these species will be devastated by us, where the human footprint, the carbon footprint on the nature will only go on increasing. The increase can be slowed down, but the increase cannot be halted or reversed. And that is what scientists have described as past all the tipping points, the Anthropocene. So these two ideas of the future for us have left us confused. Which of these would be our future, the future of our next generations? And the answer at the moment is difficult to propose a definitive answer. But that answer will not come at one go as one major intellectual breakthrough. It will come through hundreds of thousands of small steps. And one of those steps is production of knowledge as a community or a collective effort. And I firmly believe in that. I'm going to present maybe 2 or 3 short stories, brief stories to you about this collective production of knowledge. I am aware that what I'm going to present is presented through within the framework of a single nation, India, though I'm not a great advocate of nationalism. But since my life story, since I lived a life there, that framework naturally came into the my working life. But I do not mind disowning it, and I do not have great enthusiasm in owning a nationalistic framework for any intellectual work. With that caveat, let me begin with my first story. I go back to the year 1871. That's roughly 150 years back. A man called Mayo, Lord Mayo, was Governor General of India. East India Company had just ceased to be the ruler of India. The sovereign had come in from the company to the British government. India had moved, and at that time, a new legislation was brought in. That was called the Criminal Tribes Act of India. Unfortunately, the communities listed as criminal communities were not essentially criminal, not comprehensively criminal, not uniformly criminal. That list of communities was a result of very determined work by an officer prior to 1871. His name was William Sleeman, who was asked to supervise the process of disarming Indian soldiers after the defeat of Indian princes in the year 1817 or 18. Sleeman worked through the 20s, 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, listing every incidence of clash, mostly in central India. But when he made the register of clashes and conflicts, he went overboard and also listed the community name of the individuals involved. His list would have sunk into amnesia, but he died in 1855. But in 1857, what some Indians like to call the first war of independence, some like to describe as a revolt or rebellion against the British rule, took place. And after that, the new government, the Queen's government, wanted to rethink about this question of use of weapons by some people. William Sleeman's list was resurrected, and Lord Mayo decided to bring in a legislation which resolved that these communities listed by Sleeman would be restricted in their movements. So area restrictions were brought in, soft prisons were created. This is, Britain already had the 1842 Chartist movement, and the Education Commission had come in, and the new philosophy of educating criminals in order to punish them had settled. In India, the question of education did not get woven into this question of punishment, but the settlements did arrive in India, and there were specifications of 14 feet tall barbed wire fencing, through which nobody could go out. These people were the communities, 191 communities. I don't go into the question of why they were not criminals for want of time, but I'll just give an instance. The coin makers in India, traditional coin makers in India, are called Meenas. Traditional masons in India are called Waders. And Waders had heavy hammers. Meenas were decided as counterfeiters. They were first called counterfeiters, then they were described as criminals, and they were all kept into, because the British wanted to, the colonial government wanted to take over the function of minting coins. People kept in this confinement settlements. They were made to do unpaid labor. Most of the rail tracks built during the British regime and the bridges and the roads constructed during that regime were built by these people without receiving even a single rupee as labor wages. Many died. The numbers are phenomenal. There has not been a full account of how many thousands or millions died in the process. But I can give you an idea as to what that number could be. There was a census in 1931 which looked at Indian castes and communities. That was a very comprehensive caste community census. And going by that census, if one were to project the population of these 191 communities, say now, it should be roughly 120 million, 12 crores. Their ancestors were in jail for 70 years, and thousands of them died doing this hard labor. Anyway, this story was a solid story. It almost could be compared with the concentration camps, but it has not been done, and that's not my intention to do today. My intention is to tell you something different. These communities were denotified. The notification of criminality was withdrawn in 1952. The year was very interesting. Because in 1950, India had become a republic, and the schedule of castes, schedule of tribes had become official structures of the Indian state. But because that had happened in 1950, in 52, another lot of large number of communities to be brought into either the SC or ST was not possible. And therefore, these communities remained hanging loosely in between. The settlements were opened up. They were asked to go wherever they wanted because they were given a new freedom, but they had nowhere to go because they had no land. And in the eyes of the people, they were seen as branded as, as criminal communities. Therefore, wherever they went, they were either mob lynched. The moment somebody was identified as being a Banjara or a Kaikadi or a Yanadi or Yerakula or Pardi or Sasi or Bajania, mob lynched and killed, hounded out of villages and mob lynched in the cities. They kept concealing themselves, concealing their identities. And somehow at the crossroads, they kept selling balloons or unofficially produce maps of India or little toys and so on. Whenever you go to India, the kids who stand at the crossroads and sell a few things belong to these communities. Please look at them the next time you go through a different perspective. From 1952 till 1998, nearly 50 years, 45 years, nothing was done about these communities in India. In the newfound independence of India, these people remained yet free, but not fully citizened part of the Indian society. The citizenship rights were almost non-existent. And the police kept harassing them. Police often forced them into crime in order to make benefit and so on. In 1998, the Bengali writer Mahashweta Devi, I, and Marathi writer Lakshman Gaikwad, we formed an organization called the Denotified and Nomadic Tribes. The word nomadic comes because the British had great difficulty in understanding nomadic communities. Their idea of citizenship was settled or sedentary. And that's why a lot of nomadic communities were pushed into the list of criminal tribes. For instance, the baul singers in Bengal or the entertainers, the Kaikadis who do rope walking and so on. Singers, wanderers, storytellers, they all had been lumped together. Denotified and Nomadic Tribes Rights Action Group was born in 1998. As part of our campaign, when we traveled all over the country, went from every locality to every locality of these people, mobilized them. We met police officers, got their manual changed. We met judges who were completely unsympathetic to them. We met home ministers, home secretaries in the British parlance, the prime ministers of India, a number of them. And this campaign ran. But in the process, we set up many theater groups. And these people were asked to make films on themselves and write their autobiographies and books and produce poems. And a huge amount of, when I say huge, at least 100 books we published from Baroda related to denotified and nomadic tribes. Many plays were performed, many films were made, and the anthropology in India started taking note of the DNT in addition to the tribes of India. We, of course, had the various Elwin-driven and Gure-driven anthropology in India, and of course, Claude Lévi-Strauss-driven anthropology, but the denotified tribe, the non-land-related community, which is excluded from the mainstream, became part of the thinking of anthropology in India. This knowledge was produced collectively. It was not a single person's effort. And it was the collective knowledge related to collective action that brought about a change in the status of these people. Don't ask me if their lives are completely transformed. It's a slow process. But a beginning was made, a definitive beginning was made. A commission was established by the Prime Minister of India in 2008. A good report was produced. The part of the report is implemented. Many parts of the report are yet to be implemented. For instance, a proper census of these communities is yet awaited. A new commission, permanent commission to be established for them is yet to happen. But it will happen because a new consciousness has emerged. A new horizon, a new window on looking at Indian society has emerged. In this process, I discovered that if academy and the society have to come together, it is necessary to think of knowledge production in a slightly different manner. It was with that idea, that learning, that I moved into my next experiment, which was the Linguistic Survey of India. There the story begins with another British man, not so much British, Irishman. His name was George Abraham Grierson. He went from Trinity in Dublin to India in the Indian civil services. And because he was a minority in Ireland, when he was in Ireland, because he was a religious minority, and he was minority in Indian government because he was from Ireland, he remained at a relatively junior position throughout his career. And so he remained posted mostly in Bihar. And since he had done a PhD, a doctorate in linguistics, he kept studying the languages of Bihar. Towards the end of his working life, the British government decided to set up a Linguistic Survey of India office, a structure. Though the government never created any building, any establishment for that. It was created as an idea, the Linguistic Survey of India. And Grierson was summoned to head it, which he did. I think he was there for just about 4 or 5 years. Then he retired. But in those and came back to London. In those 4 or 5 years, he had asked teachers in different parts of India to send samples of their languages and also to translate one story of the prodigal son in the Bible into their own languages. Based on this and his own knowledge and learning of the historical linguistics of his times, he produced a wonderful work called the Linguistic Survey, Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India, in 11 volumes, 19 parts, describing 189 languages, 169 languages and 189 languages and 344 dialects. It was a superb, impressive work and unmatched. Hats off to that man. He spent he had made a beginning in 1898 and he continued to work till 1926, 28 years of work. And the knowledge, the wealth of knowledge he produced for India was extraordinary. His survey was taken almost as the Bible by any scholars of language in India. And they deserve to be taken that seriously. But after independence, the map of India changed. And so the Grierson survey was about one map of India. The real map of India had shifted. And secondly, the Indian Republic, the Constitution describes Indian Republic as a union of states. India, that is Bharat, is a union of states. These states were not the old princely states, as it happened maybe in the Union of Italy or Union Germany. India decided to make linguistic states. So state for Marathi, state for Gujarati, state for Kannada, and so on. Almost all of you are familiar with the story. And therefore, the new India post-independence required a new linguistic survey of India. That work was to take off in the 70s, but then next door, Bangladesh war happened and somehow that was stalled because Bangladesh had become an independent country on the question of language. The government of India felt very worried. In fact, in that decade, something terrible happened, and I should add it in passing at least. In 1961 census, the list of mother tongues as published by this census had 1,652 names of mother tongues. 1652 in 61 census. In 71 census, the data of which was disclosed was published in 1976, a few years after the Bangladesh war. The government felt very worried about this massive language diversity and decided to impose an arbitrary cutoff point of 10,000 speakers minimum in order for a mother tongue to be declared as mother tongue. I mean, this is no scientific basis at all. Even two individuals can make a language a language. One individual can speak to oneself and make a language a language. But this happened, and as a result, the 1971 census had only 109 names of mother tongues, 1652 to 109. More than 1,500 names were wiped out of public memory and official records. I was a research student at that time, in that decade, and I felt attracted to this dry data. My research was related to poetry, and I should have been actually, which I did, reading Shakespeare and Chekhov and Hemingway and Homer and Valmiki and so on. But my attention was drawn by this data, not because the number had gone down, but because there was a very enigmatic element in this new list of 109. The enigma was the first 108 names were names of mother tongues. But the 109th name read all others. So I said, what kind of mother tongue is this, all others? I was not aware of 1961 census. So therefore, I decided to look back and check with 1961 census, and I realized that more than 1,500 mother tongues were dumped into this backyard of, the caption, all others. And so I became very restless. And I decided that I'll chase this question. And a few years later, after entering academic life, I decided that I might actually step out and chase the locations of these languages. And so started wandering around in tribal area, which I did for maybe a couple of decades, finding out who speaks which language, how do they describe their own mother tongues. By then, I had also gone into the question of the denotified and nomadic communities. I and Surekha, who's present here, we traveled all along the Indian sea coast to find that people were pushed because Indian sea coasts were being sold all through. Today, they're entirely in private possession, not in the government possession. Those communities were banned from doing small-time fishing. Big trawlers had come in. As fishing communities and fishing dependent communities were all going inland and therefore deserting their languages. Wherever there is no livelihood possibility in a language, people decide to do language migration. As simple as that. We found out that nomadic communities, tribal communities, denotified tribes, and the communities, language communities that had not got their linguistic states, they were the losers. They were all others. I had been restless for several decades on this, but my restlessness got into a kind of point of culmination when in the early years of this century, the government of India decided to do a new linguistic survey. I was very happy. They set aside a sufficiently large grant for that funds. I was even happier. But in India, there's a strange issue. The question, the subject language is not placed under the Ministry of Education in India. It is placed under the Home Ministry. the police look after the language question in India, not teachers, because India has linguistic states. And so these two ministries, Ministry of Education and Home Ministry, had a tussle. They wanted to decide which ministry would get credit for doing the survey should such a survey, new survey, take place. And in that tussle, the entire idea just fell through. So at that stage, I decided to bring all my Adivasi friends, tribal friends, and denotified and nomadic communities I had known and mobilized over the decades together. And since I had a kind of a touch and go relationship with the academic world, I could invite linguists and literary scholars and poets and practically anybody who loved language. We formed a team of 3,000 persons and worked in every state, every district, every subdivision of the district over 4 years, and recorded, brought on the record 780 living languages of India, published in the form of books under the title The People's Linguistic Survey of India, which has 50 volumes and 92 parts. So out of those 92 titles, because for each state we had a part in the English language, in Hindi, as well as the state language, therefore the number of books increased. And there were some about sign languages, because India has its own own variety of sign languages. Indian signers don't copy American sign language. They have not even heard the name of America. They are from villages and so on. This work was completed, and out of 92 titles, 76 are published already. The remaining will be published by 26. As a strange coincidence, George Abraham Grierson began 100 years before in 1898 and went on to 1926. This work, completely without my desire to do that, has extended from over the same period. But after the linguistic survey, People's Linguistic Survey was published, it started getting published in 2014. And it continues. Every few months, a new title comes out. The government of India accepted the claim. And so many times in the parliament, I have heard ministers and members of parliament saying with great gusto that India has at least 700 or 800 languages. And if you go to any town, ask an averagely educated, literate person how many languages India has, they'll say 600, 700, 800, 900. The collective work of these 3,000 field volunteers has resulted into a new awareness, new knowledge, which foregrounds diversity. Now, diversity is so important for me because in my understanding, diversity, at least in India, is at the heart of Indian democracy. I'll now quickly turn to the third story. This new book is called History, the Indians' Histories of a Civilization, came up in response to a government committee. That committee was appointed to look at, to review the Indian past for the last 12,000 years. I said, why 12,000 years? Obviously, the Holocene is dated at 9,600 before Christ. That is 2,100 years on this side of Christ and 9,600 years on that side of Christ, makes it some 11,700 or approximately 12,000 years. A committee was appointed. That committee had no women, nobody from South India, nobody from Northeast, no Jew, no Parsi, no Sikh, no Jain, no Buddhist, no Muslim. I felt very worried because I thought this would be a lopsided, partisan, and history, if such a history were to be produced, and heavily loaded by an ideology which holds some kind of history at its center. And therefore, I decided to appeal to scholars in genetics, because in order to understand people's movements, population movement, scholars of agriculture, scholars of plant history, archaeology, historians of all use, prehistorians, proto-historians, and historians, because those are very nicely segmented parts of scholarly life. I appeal to linguists and philosophers, scholars of religions, and political scientists to come together and write on their respective area of expertise a very short article. This was a bit of an insult to most of them, because each one of them had spent 30 years, 40 years, 50 years working on an area. But they obliged, they agreed. They took into account the need for such a work. It came out in July. It has already gone through 3 reprints. It is being translated in 7 Indian languages. And hopefully by next year, every school teacher or college teacher will have a version of this book available in her or his language. Collectively produce knowledge, serving the purpose of widening democracy. Collectively produce knowledge, serving the purpose of defending diversity, and bringing in those sections of the society who left out in darkness into the view of the society, is just a small method which I have experienced in my active life. I now come to the concluding part and take, with your permission, about maybe 5 to 7 minutes. I want your advice. What I'm going to say matters the most. Forget about these 3 experiments. Forget that somebody did a People's Linguistic Survey of India or a big history of India. Just dump him out of this window. But what I say now matters to all of you. And it is this. Asia has about 50 countries, 48 countries. Africa has 52 countries. Africa and Asia together make 100 countries. Each one has accepted the framework of nation, but each work has accepted the framework of being a nation very recently. The history goes back to 70,000 years with the history of Homo sapiens in Africa. In history of Japan may not go to 70,000 years ago. It might go to 40,000 years ago, but it's a very long past through which humans have existed. They existed and survived because of migrations, because of enterprise, because of certain attitudes to nature, because of certain philosophies and so on. Now, I thought it will be necessary to relook at our Asia and also Africa through the perspective of the people of Asia and Africa. I have nothing against Western knowledge. I mean, I am a great friend of Western knowledge. Because I've grown up reading my Plato and my Homer and my Immanuel Kant and Derrida and all that. So I absolutely love them. Fascinating. I'm not trying to bring in hate of any kind. I'm trying to propose to you something different. The different thing is, towards the end of the 18th century, William Jones proposed that there might be a link between Latin, Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and through that, a discovery of Sanskrit. The earliest text was 1400 before Christ, that is the Rig Veda, was highlighted. And suddenly an amazement, a sense of wonderment about an ancient civilization emerged. This was the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. It was the same time when a new interest in Egyptology, new interest in Mesopotamia, followed later by various other small segments of civilization, whether it's Akkadian, whatever, Sintashta, whatever, Mitanni, emerge. I have been asking myself this question as to why the interest in civilization emerged precisely in the end of 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and not in the 15th century or later. And my answer to that is, it's a limited answer, but the answer is, because in Britain, a Birmingham, a Bradford, a Leeds, a Manchester, they were emerging. And civilization, to take it literally, based on civil, is related to city, not to culture, city. And this sense of amazement at the ancient people who had built large cities, but which declined, sadly declined. That sense of how did they build? And of course, how those cities declined, that emerged. The interest in the idea of civilization is a result of the emergence of the cities, making people think about how the urban life could be shaped. Today, as I mentioned, Anthropocene and consumption of energy and want of more and more energy, my mind goes back to the question of city. The city has become a kind of a criminal. The guzzler, the consumer of all natural resources, producer of overpopulation, producer of garbage, producer of all those gases which damage our environmental cover. The city, the city is seen as exploitative of being exploitative of the non-city, the non-urban. In these times, we have to think of the civilization once again, idea of civilization once again. And I thought, if one were to look at cities like Karachi, Bombay, Rangoon, not cities like Pandharpur or Madurai or Banaras or Makkah, but the secular cities which welcome everybody. I mean, which community is not welcome in Bombay, which community is not welcome in Rangoon, and so on. If we were to look at these cities in Asia and talk about Asian and also Africa, and talk of African and Asian civilization again, to see what have been the philosophical foundations of those. For instance, Bombay, I think of Bombay not just as Bombay city, but I think of Bombay as defined by Mount Stuart Elphinstone in 1829, when he created the Bombay Presidency. And Bombay Presidency extended from, those of you who know something about Gujarat, all the way from Nadiad, Surat, in the north to east, Nagpur, to south, Kolhapur, Dharwad. The philosophical accumulation in Bombay Presidency includes Narsi Mehta, Mahatma Gandhi, Ambedkar, Phule. These are great thinkers of human life. Each city has its philosophical foundations, if one were to go city by city like this. And based on all these, one can redefine Asian and African civilization to create a new wisdom about assimilation, acceptance, tolerance, compassion, in order to, this is my very last sentence, in order to figure out the way ahead. I said, great energy, Dyson shell, sending you from here to Mars for breakfast and bringing you back for coffee, or completely charred planet. No. I think we have to find a way out. And that way out would be when the international agencies have failed us. I mean, look at what's happening in Israel. You have Russia and what is this? Ukraine war. International agencies, I mean, we had great hopes in 1940s and 50s. They have failed. The nation state has become coercive, rigid, and it is actually using its might for surveillance over the citizens. In such times, people-to-people conversations must emerge, and people-to-people conversations require some forms which are embedded in the civilizational story of Asia and Africa, which those continents need to use. If that is done as collective work of scholars, intellectuals, writers, thinkers, philosophers, scientists, technicians, and farmers and people, we may come up with a solution that will keep the other species alive and us alive. If we don't do it and remain within the framework of this nation state, the international agencies will take care of us because they are the insurance of our future. We might disappear, neither become Homo Deus, nor become the makers of destiny of this cosmos, but just disappear as a miserably lost and failed species. It is for you to advise me as to how this can be done. Development needs to be seen differently. I mean, all of you are the world's best development organized institute. And that's my opinion. And I hope you agree with it. I hope you don't disagree with me. But that's my opinion from across the seas. I think you're the best. I think if you start this new idea of development, the world will follow you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Devy, for that brilliant, sad as well as inspiring talk. I am going to open the floor for a round of questions, if that's what I'm supposed to do, right? Yeah, okay. And so please raise the hand, or online, just post a question in the Q&A. Anyone?
Hello, am I audible? Yeah. Thank you, sir. That was very illuminating. It was one of the most insightful lectures I've ever heard. My question is about digitalization. There's increasing use of social media and access to mobile phones and the internet. So when it comes to the status of the communities and about having linguistic diversity and getting people to engage with more and more languages, how has online media affected this? Has it made things worse or better?
Well, the key term is community, which is what brings another term called communication. Language using animal forms communities. But when language is silenced, voice is taken out of it. And only a photograph of language, that is the shadow of language, to use the Greek philosophical debate, only a shadow of language is being transmitted, that forms networks. Networks have become an enemy of communities today. So the answer to your question is in this. We have to revive communities without destroying networks. Networks have an advantage. When somebody is severely ill and there's no help, a doctor can be called through network easily. But when somebody dies and you need someone to mourn for the death, networks are very superficial. Communities have touch, smell, speech. Yeah. Communities can be revived, not by going back in history, but opening new forms of dialogue. And those dialogue will have to be long distance dialogues. Man has unfortunately gulped and internalized the craving for long distance travel, communication. We have to accommodate all of that. I do not propose going back into history, but I do propose that we must save languages from becoming entirely silent. Out of 7,000 living languages in the world, well, let me go back to India. Out of those 1,652 mother tongues, 2011 count shows that 280 have died languages are dying. They're absolutely tragically, massively dying, like people died during Corona. There's an epidemic, there's an epidemic of aphasia affecting languages. And fewer people speak. Even in a family, 3 persons sit together, each one is into her mobile or his mobile, and nobody speaks to each other. We'll have to revive language. And language revival is not just increasing the word counts. It is engaging, creating dialogues. Dialogic conversational spaces have to be created across borders. Thank you.
Lisa, please.
Shall I jump in? Well, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. And I think you've really set us off, this series off very, very well. And I think many of us who study development on this campus would be the first to agree with you that that formal notion of development as what policymakers in the aid industry doesn't begin to touch what development really should be, which depends on collective knowledge production from many, many parts of the world. Its development is, in a sense, about good change as defined by people, by collectivities, through communication, through dialogue. So I think you've absolutely struck some chords. Where I would slightly like to take issue or maybe push you a bit further, you've made a really strong and interesting case about language and why multiple languages and mother tongues, language as in formal written speech and writing, is so important to diversity, to conversation, to community. But is there an additional argument that actually language is much more than that, the kind of communication that creates community amongst people and with the natural world or in their cities is also multisensory, it's embodied, it's the engagements with the world around, with the forests, with the soils, or in a city with the social fabric, the urban fabric, the air, the streets. And is there a danger in going too far, giving too much agency to formal language in this process and overlooking these more multisensory forms that we know have been so important, for instance, to Adivasi ways and indeed indigenous ways of living with nature everywhere, arguably are important in everybody's everyday lives and perhaps need a bit more recognition alongside the arguments about formal language and its diversity.
I mean, I entirely agree with what you say. Absolutely. Maybe I'll stand so that they can have. I entirely agree with you in what you say. And what you say reminds me of the following. A professor of reading, not the University of Reading, but somebody who studies cognitive processes related to reading. Marianne Wolf, she wrote a brilliant book called Proust and the Squid. And she argues that the human brain is showing a great fatigue, the Broca's lobe, which processes the world through language, showing great fatigue. And therefore, so many children are found unwilling to read and unwilling to speak. And dyslexic children, in her argument, are far ahead of our times. Then she says that dyslexia is evolutionary processes way of finding a path forward. And there she says, unless there is a great diversity available, the process of evolution won't go ahead. It will come to be blocked. So in that sense, yes, we need to move ahead. But exactly where, I mean, it's almost like if I look at it, a plant, I don't know from where the new branch will come out. But it does. The plant knows exactly how to find its way ahead. I think language is not just verbal language, but there's the visual language. Marianne Wolf also says that the human brain now has decided conclusively to grasp the world through the prefrontal cortex through visual images rather than oral the languages, many languages, not just verbal languages, is what we need to grasp. And given my mind was going back to your question, given new technological capacities, we should use them to understand more kinds of languages, more kinds of conversations. That would be a good use of, rather than rejecting the technology or putting it in competition with this or that. But how we do it can be decided when all of us come together. Alone, a single mighty scientist or thinker won't be able to sort out this question. This is the question for the entire species. And a large number of the species must come together to solve this question. It can be solved. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Devy. But Professor Devy, then your idea of community involves other species. It's a multi-species community?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. There is a question online. What is the role of writers in this case? I mean, can you suggest some ways by which they can contribute to the collective action of knowledge production?
To pay attention to the question of silence. Because aphasia is we are imposing aphasia on other species. Aphasia is being imposed on us by the state. The imagined international community is imposing aphasia on nations. This imposed silence is what the writers must break and get into that question, how to get past. Colonialism was an issue, say last 200 years. We understood what it was. It is time for us to go beyond, and as seriously as we dealt with the question of colonialism, imperialism, and so on, capital and so on, as you know, with so much gusto, we must now deal with the question of silence. That's what writers can do. Writers can break silence, understand silence, write silence, interpret silence, present new forms of silence to fight silence being imposed as terror and intimidation.
Thank you, Professor Devy. There's a question in the room. Yes, please.
Hi, sir, thank you for a wonderful
I thought you said there's an elephant in the room. There's a question in the room. Okay.
I wish there was an elephant in the room.
Sir, I was wondering if you could talk about your experience of actually organizing the collection of this knowledge, because the reason I ask is it doesn't seem to be a priority for development agencies or governments to actually produce collective knowledge. So how did you navigate that space?
Development agencies development agencies won't bring us knowledge. They bring us first aid. They bring us reason to feel satisfied momentarily. Because the moment they go away, the question resurfaces. Knowledge, in order to be universal, has to be local. Universal knowledge cannot be localized. Local knowledge can be universalized. Now, how narrow is your local can be an issue. Overpride in one's locality, local knowledge, will be disastrous. Like I hear in some countries, the claims made about everything being there in the past can be disastrous. But I somehow think Gautam Buddha had a very good answer to your question. Therefore, I'll repeat what he said about it. He said, you recognize your problem. And in that recognition, half the problem is solved. And then try to describe it, the remaining half will be solved. So recognize what is the issue with your local knowledge. And that's actually, the beginning of development is not development agency. Beginning of development is new awareness on knowledge of who you are, what you need and what you do not need. That's development. Therefore, there cannot be universal parameters for development. all children in the world cannot have equal degree of hemoglobin or length of nose and so many kilograms of body at the age of 3.5, and it variety, diversity operates. But people ought to know what the local parameters are, and that means to respect the local knowledge and make the thinkers there more confident. If people are silent, I'm not talking about them. For instance, people working in the salt mining area have not been able to talk about their issues. But if they did, then departments of chemistry would be able to solve their problems. And their skin, literally their skin can be saved. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Devi. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. Your speech make me think about China's language development, because I come from China, and there have been also a lot of unity and diversity during the linguistic development in our history. For example, in the Qing dynasty, the Emperor Qing unified most of the language into somewhat like the Mandarin today. But at the same time, the diversity of local languages didn't disappear. They are still there. So I think maybe my question is following Melissa's question, that it seems there are two kinds of development. Development of unity and development of diversity. Both of these two kinds of development should be maintained. Only when they two could be maintained together, a country can develop in its real status. Yeah, this is some of the comments. And another one, maybe a question for you. Just now you mentioned civilization come from civil or cities. So my question is that, according to the four ancient civilizations, including Mesopotamia, Indian and Chinese, and I forgot the fourth one. Egyptian. Yeah, most of them are agricultural societies. So when we talk about diversity, we say cultural diversity instead of civilization diversity. So is that could we understand is like this? This kind of diverse, or when we see culture, is it more appropriate to use the civilization in the linguistic, or this kind of non-material heritage domain? I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a brilliant question. I mean, thank you for asking it. Asking these two questions. I agree with I agree with you in one question and disagree with you in the other. But let me first state the agreement. The Chinese attitude to language has diversity embedded in it, beginning with the script. You write it horizontally, you write it vertically. It's okay. And Chinese Mandarin brought a vast amount of literature in translation into Chinese. So those were the links with other languages in the world. I think in all over the world, if there's any country, any language culture which excels in translations, it is the Chinese language culture. And translation is an implicit confession of presence of two or more languages, because it's a marriage of languages. As far as the other question about civilization, it is a fact. I mean, culture is what material change and ways of life change. And so culture changes or stabilizes. And nobody's outside culture. Nobody's out, just as nobody's outside the atmosphere, nobody's outside language, nobody's outside meaning, nobody's outside culture. If culture is a flowing stream, current of a river, civilization is a specific point in its history, which is outstanding because of monuments majestic ideas and very impressive things to show. As far as your agricultural civilization in India or China, I disagree. I agree. I accept that people, by and large, follow agriculture in China or in India. That picture is changing very rapidly. If one were to do a good survey of urbanization, one will find that the agrarian villages are no longer in their imagination and aspirations like villages, but most like cities. But setting that aside, that exception aside, agriculture spread after the Homo sapiens move into this part of the world, your part of the world. From hunter-gatherers, they move into pastoral, nomadic habits, and from their agrarian ways of life, the rice and wheat, both those fashions of agriculture emerge, and they continue. But civilization, as in the Indus civilization or in the Egyptian civilization times of pyramids and so on, or in the times of, say, in Iraq and Iran, the times of, let's say, 3rd millennium before Christ, where writing emerges and all that, they are city-specific episodes. So I differ in my culture is continuous. Civilization is a specific, slightly stabilized part of that larger flow. Today, I'm talking of attitude to civilization once again, because this city has come to be seen as a problem, not as a solution. For the industrial society, city was seen as a solution. Today, it is seen as a problem. And I'm not in favor of cities as such or favor of villages. I'm in favor of dialogue between culture and civilization, between city, rural and the urban, between nation and nation, between gender and gender, and between language and language. How wonderful it would be if your people and my people thought of us as one people. Our governments are breaking their heads against each other on the border. But if we were to think of ourselves as one people, that would be wonderful. And those dialogues is what the suzerainty, the dominance of the nation state. Will reduce the dominance of the nation state. Those dialogues, interlingual, interreligious, intergender dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Devy. I also wonder, in relation to the excellent question, whether development or in unity or development of unity is parasitic on development of diversity. I wonder what your views are on that. But there is another question. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Devy. It was a wonderful talk and it was really inspiring. And I was just thinking about your work, decades of work that you have been doing with the people, with the indigenous people, especially in India. And I could not help but think that this effort to head, touching into the localized knowledge of our country, it must have also led you to unearth narratives that are essentially anti-establishment. And given the present situation in our country and also around the world, I was just thinking that when we go as young researchers or people who do not essentially have that social protection because of their status in the society, when they go and tries to unearth these narratives and kind of form this collective knowledge, how do we navigate that space, that space where we come in direct conflict with the state, and especially if the state is this majoritarian like in India? And what has been your experience? Because I think the question of heterogeneity is always very threatening to power, because they have in development as well as I'm reading, there has for long there was an effort to look at the world from a very homogeneous lens, because it helped them.
So I was just thinking about that. What about that conflict with the state, and how do we navigate that, or how did you deal with that?
Well, it's a real question. And I have often asked this question to myself, faced it in all consequences. But the answer is a happy answer. With this history committee, and you know, history is very dear to the ideology of the government. After this book came out, the Indian Council for Historical Research decided to drop their plans for writing their report. Too many, 90% are saying this, so better keep lying low. That's the attitude, that's the approach they accepted. With the Linguistic Survey of India, when I completed the work, the education minister called me. At that time, it was UPA government. UPA stands for whatever, Progressive Alliance. I think that was the nomenclature they used. It was Mr. Kapil Sibal. So he called me to Delhi, asked me what it was all about, and then I narrated the whole thing. He said, what can we do for you? So I said, sir, please do nothing. And he allowed me to complete it. That is, he had the might to stop us from doing the linguistic survey because language is subject for the police department. I mean, they had every right to declare me as, put me under UAPA or whatever that, infamous law is at that time. They did not. 3,000 persons from 700, 800 languages saying something could not be stopped by the government. It's the same with the denotified tribes. They're minority in every state. But when from state after state they came together, and we held a very massive convention in Delhi in 2007, in 10 days' time, the national government had to appoint a new commission. Because far too many people, it's not the question of numbers, it's the question of extent. And one can view that. Supposing the Development Institute in Sussex and the Development Institute, let's say in Abu Dhabi and New York and Delhi, they all say, this is not right development, the governments all over the world will have to accept that. There is a Sanskrit shloka, which I do not remember, but I remember the meaning. And it says, when many people speak, it is God's speech. It is truth. So the manyness, unity, of course, but the manyness of, they must speak, they must come around, come along a single issue, bring their perspectives and create a new path. Many times these efforts will fail and individuals will be at risk. One may have to go to prison. But truth has a wonderful quality of giving the truth speaker courage. And what can a prison do to somebody who speaks truth? You know the case of Socrates. You know the case of Jesus Christ. You know the case of Gandhi. The murderers have gone, but they have remained. So why worry? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Devy. I might take the prerogative of asking a couple of questions. I have 3 of them, but there's another one in the room. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. My next question is following on from what the previous 2 questions were, which is about commonality of narrative. You've worked with so many different languages, and of course, all the languages are formed in different geographies with different institutions and different experiences. But since there is a lot of commonality in human emotions, is it true that there would be a lot of commonality in the kind of stories that are being told, which should be relatable to people who don't really understand the language and come from different parts of the world? And say the way we have visual media today, in which a lot of languages from different parts of the world, which we don't understand, are being used to tell stories for recreational purposes in which we relate to, and so we try to understand. I know, for instance, that in Morocco, Hindi Bollywood films have tended to become very popular, not because people understand the language, but because the stories really appeal to them, and through subtitles, and then later with an understanding of the language is also developed. So do you think that there is a lot of scope for using appealing narratives and stories to create the dialogue which we've been talking about?
Yeah, it is. I mean, human emotions is a business of the biochemicals in the brain. To look at it very mechanically in a dry way. Human emotions, of course, can drive people to action, but action arising out of emotion does not go a long way. That's also a fact. As far as human beings all over the world will have, given the nature of the biochemicals constructed in the body, will have similar kind of emotions. However, these are different communities have arisen over the last, let's say, 45,000 years as population knots, KNOTS, and have assimilated a lot of local factors and culture. So there is a unity, commonality. There's also difference, and the appreciation of what is common and the appreciation of what is different. Both need to go together. Rabindranath Tagore focused more on the commonality among civilizations, cultures, Japan, China, India, and that's why he said that we must immediately go beyond the idea of nation and get into a pan-Asian idea of being together and so on. And his theory said that excess of emotion brings in enlightenment. It is true to some extent, but the appreciation of difference brings in a greater rationality to go together with the emotions, sentimentality. Demagogues often work on the emotions of the people, but they rarely get into disturbing the rationality of people. Both are necessary. And Shah Rukh Khan is a great guy. I mean, next time you go and watch his film, do send a ticket to me. I will also join you. Thank you.
And he's a superstar in Morocco, huh? Shah Rukh Khan, absolutely. You have a question too? Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Hello, sir. Based on your sharings on culture and traditions, I'll talk something which I had recently petitioned about in India, about the development of the Sabarmati Ashram, right? And similarly, when we look at development, what happened in Narmada on the name of Statue of Unity, a lot of displacement of the communities over there. And that's what the same thing is happening in the ashram, right? So what do you think we as development sector professionals should, kind of take that thing as?
See, I'll be explicit on this. 2 years back, maybe 2.5 years back, Anand Patwardhan, the filmmaker, telephoned me. So he was very disturbed. He said, look, the Gujarat government has decided to redevelop Sabarmati Ashram. So I contacted Kartikeya Sarave, who is a trustee, and also Ila, but Ilaben is no more, and great lady. I said, we want to talk to you. Please convene a meeting of the trustees. They convened a meeting of the trustees, and we asked them if these reports are rumors or actual news. She said that there is no definite decision about creating a 5-star hotel in Sabarmati Ashram land. But Mr. Sarabhai told me that while there is the street on the right-hand side of the street is Sabarmati Ashram, where Gandhi occupied a house and Kasturba Gandhi, they said their prayer. On the left-hand side is the Gaushala. Then there is agricultural experimentation and khadi, weaving. That part is large. It is 90 acres as against the 14 acres on the right-hand side where Gandhi and Vinoba also lived. Was it Vinoba? No. There's another great person who lived there. So Mr. Sarabhai said that the change will happen in the larger land without touching Gandhi's side of Sabarmati Ashram. This is what the trustees said. And therefore, we thought that they knew what was happening. But it is the government of Gujarat that decided to set up this new structure to kind of run the ashram. And through ordinances and administrative orders, they decided to bring in those new developments. I was thinking what Gandhi would have thought of this. So I had a long discussion with Mr. Rajmohan Gandhi on this question, with whom I spent very recently about 3 days. And it's not just the Sabarmati Ashram, but also in Banaras, then Wardha, where I've been very many times. It's my most favorite place where the entire structure is taken over. Rajmohan Gandhi said that Gandhi did not become Gandhi because of his ashrams, but because of his ideas. And if we look at those ideas and imbibe them, we might be able to arrest some of these developments. In that connection, I recalled and shared with him a story about a Chinese philosopher who one time his followers had to put all his documents and manuscripts together, hide them inside a wall. And that wall was opened up after 300 years. You know this? Who? Yeah, you're right. Yes. Yes. So the most famous Chinese philosopher, his books went underground for 300 years. The wall was opened up after 300 years, and his wisdom spread all over the world. Gandhi cannot be killed so easily. When I say this, it is not a defeatist thing. Sabarmati Ashram needs to be, but embedded in its history for the last 40 years, there were seeds of this decline. That also we have to accept, which means Gandhians have to. Gandhi would have said, if you want to change the world, change yourself. What more can I say? Thank you.
It's a good point. I think we are running out of time now. I have my questions, so maybe I'll ask them after we are through here. So thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Devy, for an inspiring talk and a great response to the questions. I hope all of you are satisfied and happy with this response. If there's anything, of course, hang around and we can have a chat. And the Sussex Development Lecture Series is officially open. The next couple of lectures, I don't remember the next speaker's name, but after that, there's Olivier de Schutter, who used to be the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, and now he's the UN Special Rapporteur. He keeps on getting UN Special Rapporteurs, but anyway, he's some UN Special Rapporteur at the moment as well. So he's coming. So you guys are welcome to join again. And that's all. Is there anything else I need to say?
Yeah, the second lecture is Mohammed Abu Nimr, and that is on the 1st of November, and then Professor on the
Olivier de Schutter, yeah.
is on the 11th of November.
Thank you, Mahendra. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Professor Devy, again. Thank you, all of you.